Welcome to Practical Parapsychology. Join your PhD host Drs. Brian Laythe and Cindy Little as they arm you with the latest scientific research and know-how on ghostly phenomena. Brian is the lead author of the groundbreaking new book, Ghosted, Exploring the Haunting Reality of Paranormal Encounters, and Cindy is the proprietor of WacoGhost.com, a portal for professional investigations and public education on ghostly phenomena. Together, with their reoccurring guest, parapsychologist Dr. James Huran, they will take important steps with you to gain scientific answers about the nature of the paranormal experiences and the people who have them. For more information on practical parapsychology, visit their website at www.practicalparapsychology.com. Practical Parapsychology. The class is now in session.
There we go. Yep, we're having one of those days. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Practical Parapsychology. I'm Brian Laythe with Cindy Little, otherwise known as my evil overlord, keeper of the sacred flame, daughter of Yog Sothoth, for anyone that likes Lovecraft references. But I believe she told me to call her Her Majesty. Good day, Your Majesty.
Hello, my friend.
Well, hello. Guys, today we're going to get deep in the academic research soup. We're going to start a series over the next couple of episodes where we're going to talk about subjective and objective haunt phenomena. So I don't know about you, but years ago when I had a lot more hair, I always wished there was data out there that could give me an idea of how common and how frequently different types of phenomena that people experience in haunt environments actually occur. I wanted like a reference. I wanted a master sheet. Well, years and years later, we actually managed to construct a scale, a survey of strange events. And we're very happy about it. And we're going to talk to the lay people out there, for this episode at least, about making a distinction between subjective haunting events and objective haunting events using the SSE scale. So probably the first question we might have is, what is the difference between a subjective haunting event and an objective haunting event? What do you think, Cindy? That's a lead in, by the way.
Well, yeah. Yes. The subjective events are those that are, this is how I define them, that are uniquely experienced by someone. For example, if you sense a presence, or you feel as though you've been touched, or you smell an odd smell or something, and nobody else around you experiences these things. Only you are able to experience these things. Hence the term subjective. Objective, on the other hand, is phenomena that everyone is able to witness in some way or another. I think of poltergeist activity, things moving, things breaking, things, appearing out of nowhere. And those are a lot easier to measure and to document than the subjective events.
Yeah, I mean, it's the holy grail is always capturing objective events theoretically in controlled conditions, right? So that you can rule out alternative causes and go, yep, this is weird, all right. But this brings us to kind of like one of the important things, in that we have to deal with a tricky sort of phenomena, in that is an apparition, right? If you see an apparition, is it objective or is it subjective? What do you think?
Well, no, that's a really excellent question. And to even muddy the waters further, apparitional accounts, there will be a bunch of witnesses where somebody is standing there saying, "Hey, I see an apparition." And then the person next to them is saying, "I don't see an apparition, but I'm hearing phantom footsteps." And then another person is standing there saying, "Well, I don't see anything or hear anything, but I'm smelling an odd perfume smell." So I think that's really kind of where the things can get confusing, and that, it sounds, in that experience, it sounds like something odd is going on that everyone seems to be experiencing, but in kind of a subjective way. And I know we're going to get into this a little bit more, but these ideas of subjective and objective aren't really, really cut and dried as we think they are.
Well, okay, I'm going to fight you a little bit on that. They can be cut and dried, but really the discriminating feature of an O event versus an S event is your ability to objectively document it. right?
Right.
So if you see the apparition, but we don't
Mhm.
have video footage, we don't have any other sort of evidence to support it, then we have to treat it as a subjective event, right? Because
Yes.
it
Yes.
happened through your five senses, right?
Mhm.
On the other hand, though, if we have video footage of a type of apparition, right? Well, now it's
Mhm.
kind of a no event. But it's worth noting on the scale that we measure all apparitions as subjective events, right? And we have a couple of questions, in fact, that address where you've seen an apparition on video, which would then be an objective event.
Right.
And you know that's a point I really want to hammer home with anyone listening, which is if there's not documentation and evidence for it, most of this stuff is in fact subjective events, because you know we're experiencing through our five senses. You know, witnesses help, right? You know, having additional witnesses. But you know, I think we were talking on Rob's show a little while back. There are a lot of cases where in a group of people, one person will see the apparition, but no
Mhm.
one else will. But there's also cases where they all see them. It's not consistent in any like kind of
Right.
way, shape, or form.
Right.
Um, so what do you think? How do you think it's best to for us to capture some of these? How do we deal with subjective events? In other words, like what's with you as a professional ghost hunter? What do you do with subjective events? How do you treat them in terms of evidence?
As a rule of thumb, I do not treat them as evidence if they are just standalone. And that's, like I said, that's just kind of a rule of thumb in how I do things. If somebody comes up to me and says, I'm feeling chills on the back of my neck, I think there's a ghost in the room. And this is actually pretty common.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. And so I look at that and say, well, keep an eye on it and be on the lookout for anything else that could be going on. But I am looking for multiple measurable, hopefully objective events that are going on at the same time so we can kind of triangulate it.
yeah,
It's because at least in my own experience, when something anomalous or, possibly paranormal is going on, there's multiple subjective and objective reports. I feel the cold chill. I saw that chair move over there. But you bring up a really, really good point. We have to be able to document these things. And so it's really important to have the cameras rolling or have, the audio recorders going, hopefully to capture something that's going on. But yeah, my rule of thumb is triangulation. I mean, the more data we can collect about the environment, about the events, whether they're subjective or objective, and just to try and put that all together and see if we can, have a little bit of validation going on.
Well, speaking of kind of items that can occur, I'll turn it back to like the core items of the SSE itself. One of the interesting things, a little tidbit from the data that we collected, for instance, having people witness a nondescript visual form, right? So like,
Mhm.
from experience, streaks of light or something that was vaguely sort of human shape, is about 12% more likely than seeing a distinct human formed apparition. Right.
Mhm.
And it's those kind of gaps like that I wanted years ago. I wanted to know what the likelihood of different kinds of phenomena were. Likewise, if you look at movement of objects, those tend to be in the 40 to 50% range, right? So psychokinesis of various forms, and even teleportation, right? So where
Mhm.
objects, maybe just because of bad, paying attention to the environment, but teleportation is, in the 50, 60% range for most people's accounts. But I think it's interesting that you get those gaps, right?
Mhm.
So, and it's also notable that a lot of what we're describing in terms of negative touches, negative presences, or positive presences, those are the most common sort of features of haunting that are reported, right? Those
Mhm.
fall into our common category of the SSE.
Very
Um,
much.
but and as it gets more spectacular in terms of like, didn't I see this on a movie once?
Yeah. Those
You
are
know,
rare.
yeah,
Oh man, I would
yeah.
love that, but those are so rare.
Yeah, so and interestingly enough, you would think things like I saw an angel or demon, right? We have an item on the SSE, which by the way, if you want to look at this scale, it's on practicalparapsychology.com. We uploaded it for this episode, and we have a surprise for you at the end for some citizen science. But seeing a divine figure or seeing like a fairy-like figure, you would think was relatively rare, but they're not. They're actually relatively common. If I'm offhand, around the 40-45% range. So it's really speaking to the fact that people are having a wide variety of haunting experiences. That in some cases, obviously I would never recommend people using movies, right, as an example for what to expect. And in fact, our research
No,
talks about that, and we're going to talk
please
about it.
don't.
Yeah, no.
Please don't.
Yeah, ever.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that those type of phenomena, although obviously less flashy, less produced, et cetera, I mean, are actually present. When we ask
Yes.
people, what have you experienced, they will report these sort of interactions. So, it's kind of a testament to the high strangeness of the world.
I agree.
So why don't you, because we got a little time here, why don't you give us your one of your personal experiences?
I have seen, I'd love to. I have seen a full body apparition. I was on a ghost tour of a local haunted theater here, and we were in the basement, and there was a bunch of guests there. And I had my EMF meter out as usual and was looking at it and not paying too close of attention. And I glanced up and I saw another guest standing over in a corner, and behind him was yet another guest. And so I thought, oh, okay, there's a couple of guys over in the corner checking things out. And so the guest that was behind the first one steps out from behind the guy. And he is, I'd say a guy in his 30s, dark hair, light shirt, medium build, just a guy. And he starts walking towards me. And when he gets about even with me, he just disappears into thin air. And I was shocked, but I was like super excited. And I was like, oh my gosh, I just saw an apparition. I just saw a full body apparition. Nobody else saw it though. Nobody
See,
else even experienced anything strange. It was a completely subjective experience. And I have been doing this for 15 years now, and I've never seen anything like that since or previous to that.
Well, but this is the point. I bet if I asked you, did that leave kind of a permanent mark in your mind? Right? You'd probably
Yeah.
you'd say yes. And that's kind of the point is, even though we're saying these are subjective experiences and maybe not provable, they sure as heck have an impact on people's belief in psychology, regardless of
Yes.
whether or not they can be proved.
Yes.
So we are actually coming up to our first break. On the other side of this, we'll be back with practical parapsychology. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Laythe with Dr. Cindy Little, and we are discussing haunting phenomena, right? And we're making a distinction between subjective events and objective events using the scale that we've all created called the Survey of Strange Events. So here's our next kind of fun point in the research that we did in trying to quantify the type of experiences that people have, right? There has been this debate in parapsychology for a while. And Cindy, I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's this idea that subjective events are somehow different than objective events, in the sense of there's this, group of phenomena that, should only be S events, right? And there's this separate group of O phenomena, right? These objective events, and they shouldn't mix together, and they're different birds. But one of the most interesting things we found when we started putting the SSE scale together is that when we did all the fancy math, we discovered that S and O events are intertwined. They don't represent separate groups of phenomena. They are built in with each other, right? Suggesting that there's kind of this backbone of high strangeness, right?
Yes.
And that, in real life, when people have these kind of experiences, they are going to experience subjective presences, right? They're going to feel a presence, or maybe they might even hear an odd noise. And really, we've done some research suggesting that tends to blow up over time into more obvious objective events, right? But yeah, one of the key points here, and one of the things we kind of harp with other people talking about this scale in the research, is that making a separation between the two, in terms of only one will occur over here, only S events will occur over here, and only O events will occur over here, is not how it mathematically works out. They appear to be intertwined with each other. One hierarchy of S and O events with a set probability, right? So, that raises the question I would put to you, Cindy, like in your experience as a ghost hunter, what have you found? Do you find that O events happen on their own, that S events build up to O events? What's your experience?
I find that a lot of times when something weird is going on, that there is a combination of S and O events. Primarily, there are a lot of S events, and this is something that I kind of try to take note of is that kind of group contagion
Yeah.
that a lot of times happens. You have to kind of be careful of that, whether it's an S event or an O event, and that is the person, like I said earlier, the person who gets a cold chill, as soon as they declare that, there's a bunch of people, oh my goodness, I feel that chill too. Yeah, I'm getting cold too. So aside from that, I would say the objective events are pretty rare, but not to say that the subjective events should be dismissed. I think those can be equally informative and important, whether or not they are documented on video, for example. I always, after a case, record all of the subjective and objective events. I think it's really important because it creates an entire picture of what could be going on, whether it's paranormal, normal, something that's still unexplained. It's all very important information.
Yeah. And well, and that kind of, and I'm sure you've probably had this experience too, as we've both been out in the field for several years. I don't know about you, but I always noticed there were some people, right? I would always have some people in my group that were phenomenally more prone to having a
Yes,
series of subjective events, right?
very much.
To the point that, you would know that if you sent in Susie,
Yeah.
metaphorically, Susie, right? Um, you know,
Yes.
within 2 minutes, there was going to be, blood and vomit and oh my God, and everything's going on. And then you would send in someone else. And they're like, oh, I didn't get nothing, and they,
Yes.
after an
Oh,
hour.
yes.
But
Yes.
that does bring the point. We kind of hinted at this in the first episode. There is a particular profile of person that's more likely to have these types of experiences, and we know that higher degrees of the variable of transliminality, right, in conjunction
Yeah.
with other traits, tends to facilitate people having these kinds of experiences in the first place. But I would also say, right, and we'll get to a kind of a caveat of this because I'm sure you and I can swap stories on this. Sometimes people that are very prone to having S events can end up into some, whether you can prove it or not, some pretty spooky situations. And that makes me think of, the dreaded cut, scratches, handprints, shoving, that sort of thing. And, it raises a question because someone shows, look, I have a scratch. So is that an objective event or a subjective event? It's a test, Cindy. Don't get it wrong.
I know. Oh
Don't
my
get it wrong.
gosh. How about this? It could be either one.
Oh, nope. Not, you know what? I'm going to respectfully disagree. Oh, was it Queen? Oh, Madam Queen? I'm not sure what the title was. Here's the thing. We know about a whole series of disorders called somatoform disorders, right?
Mhm.
And somatoform disorders in a nutshell, from the clinical psychology shelf, is when, or are when the brain can produce physical effects in the body. So, one of the most trickiest things, and I know you've dealt with it too in the field, but even studying it, one of the trickiest things for us to deal with when we're recording these sort of events is that we know in theory a person's mind can make a scratch. I mean, conversion disorder, which is something veterans get in some cases because of trauma, they end up having their minds convince themselves that they're paralyzed, and they genuinely are paralyzed or deaf
Mhm.
or blind. So we know the mind is powerful enough in the right situations to create really strong physical effects in the body. But of course, now the question is, right? I'm going to be my own skeptic.
Mhm.
Can the mind make your skin split open?
Well, yeah, and that's why I said it could be either one. And I think this is where the waters can get a little bit murky because say you had your camera out and you're videoing a scratch as it is forming on the person. I would think a subjective scratch would be one of these somatoform disorders going on, somebody mentally able to scratch themselves. That's crazy, but I, wouldn't put it beyond the realm of possibility. Or is there something in the environment external scratching them? And I look at that and say, okay, we are videoing a scratch forming on the person. We know they're not using their finger to scratch themselves. So, really, what is this event? I just don't think it can be all that cut and dried.
And that's an area I agree with you on. In fact, I mean, I don't want to discount, the power of the mind over the body. We know that happens. There's a strong body of literature on it. At the same time, you're not going to find in the literature people spontaneously breaking out in scratches and cuts.
Yeah.
I've seen a handprint form on
Yeah.
on a 14-year-old female's arm, right? And I've seen those scratches and cuts appear, and I know the people; they're not going to fake them. And it seems like it's a bit of a different bird. So I'm
Mhm.
kind of with you. I don't think somatoform disorders completely rule out those type of subjective events as potentially anomalous.
Mhm.
That's the way potentially anomalous. I'm not going to say a ghost. No,
No, well, no.
potentially anomalous.
Something how about this? Some unknown environmental factor could be at play.
Well, scientifically said.
How about that? That
It's
work?
yeah. Does this sound familiar? It's not an apparition, Cindy. It's a visual anomaly.
A visual anomaly,
Not
yes.
an visual anomaly.
Yes.
But relatedly in experiences, I had one person. We even talk about it in Ghosted. They felt punched in the gut and puked all over the
Yeah.
floor one time at a place, and I have seen another guy get smacked straight down to the floor. Just stood up and within 3 seconds just conked right out. So on the one hand, I definitely want to give cuts and scratches. Okay, they're subjective, they're internal to the person, and we can't sort out what is what. At the same time, they do seem to be different in a way. They do tend to be a little bit more extreme, and certainly more spooky in the haunted environment.
Well, and there are people that can actually see these things happening. I mean, you saw the guy getting punched in the gut by what appeared to be a phantom fist or something.
Yeah.
I mean, and you could record these things. I mean, these things are recordable and documentable, but you look at that and say, well, what did I just see? What did I just record? That's where it gets a little more tougher than recording a vase that breaks or a cup that moves across a counter. And even then, I want to make a point on those objective ones. They aren't as cut and dried as
No.
people would like to believe. I mean, there have been a number of stories I've heard from people that work in bars that, oh, I saw a cup move across the counter, and it's like, well, how do you know the counter didn't have a bunch of water on it? How do you know that the counter was level? I mean, you can get into that as well and say, well, even the objective things that you think might be anomalous can have mundane explanations.
But I'll circle around and I'll be the believer, I guess, or maybe I should say the critiquer of science. There's a point where the methods break down. There's just a
Mhm.
point where we can't get enough detail to
Yeah,
make a better case. But
right.
again, I would remind all the people listening from our first episode that you never get to 100%.
Mhm.
Anyone that tells you about science absolutely proving something is doing religion, right? So the best we can do with some of these events, O or S, is rule out as many alternative causes as possible. But there's a point where little tiny things like maybe the floor wasn't level, maybe there was, I'm thinking about somebody like you said, an invisible fist, right? Well,
Mhm.
maybe I have such a high resolution camera, I can go in and blow up, right? I can blow up where that person got hit, and I can see an indentation on their clothing, right?
Right.
And I'm like, oh, well, I've proven now that was a ghost fist, right? A
Mhm.
skeptic's immediately going to go, how do you know that wasn't wind?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
How do you know that that wasn't him moving his body in a certain way and causing the coat to distort itself? And they're not wrong. right? So we're always, if we're going to be scientific about, phenomena, we always have to go as far as we can go and understand that we're never going to get to an unassailable, absolutely proven anomalous event. In fairness, for you ghost hunters out there, mainstream scientists can't do that either with the stuff they're studying, right? So you do the best you can.
Yeah, I mean, the scientific method has limits, and then I remember the phrase during COVID. I follow the science, and it always kind of made me cringe because, at least in our culture, we see science and scientists as the absolute keepers of truth, and nothing could be further from the truth. We deal in possibilities,
Well,
probabilities.
I'm not having that. If you're going to trash science, we're going to take a commercial break right
Okay.
now, and we'll be
Okay,
back. And we'll be
okay.
back in just a minute with practical parapsychology. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Brian Laythe with Cindy Little, and we are discussing haunting phenomena, particularly the difference between subjective haunting events and objective haunting events. And I just raised my eyebrows as if people listening to this could see it, but obviously they can if they're watching the show. So, to get back to your point, I want to make sure everyone understands we're not saying that science isn't a great way of figuring things out, but we are making a point that science can't make claims that things are 100% absolutely proven. And in fact, the very nature and philosophy of science and the math we use to do it prohibits us from really ever making a claim that something is 100% explained. And by the way, that's not so much philosophy as our inability to measure everything, right?
Yeah.
That may seem weird to hear from some people, but if I'm measuring, if I go mainstream and I'm measuring anxiety and depression in a group of people, right? If I haven't measured their family history, if I haven't measured their background, if I haven't measured the environment they're in, any of those factors could theoretically be contributing to how anxious and depressed they are. Right. Now, I mean, that's a mainstream clinical example, but it's the same thing when we apply it to hauntings. Can we possibly measure every aspect in a place that's supposedly haunted? Is there a way for us to measure all of it 100%? The answer is no, right?
Mm.
So therefore, we end up in a scenario where we can say, well, it's more likely that this happened because of this. And here's our body of evidence, right, to say that this was an objective event or this was an apparition because we know that there's not light sources in the room or we have cameras proving that there weren't hoaxing, et cetera, et cetera. But there's always stuff we didn't measure. Right. So, one of our big, maybe preachy things that we're going to go on about in this show is that absolutes don't exist. And it's not good to really make a claim of absolutes if you're being scientific with phenomena.
Amen.
Oh, yeah. See, look, I am. Okay.
Amen.
Yeah, I say as if I'm a preacher talking about science. So let's actually talk a little bit about the hierarchy, right? The survey of strange events, because to give the listeners a little bit of a difference. We separated, right, with the SSE. We actually ended up creating a scale of probabilities. What are the odds of the average Joe, right, in a haunting environment? How many people essentially will experience different types of phenomena? And so we were able to calculate from samples, right, real life samples, how likely it was, right? What were the odds that you would experience various types of phenomena? And then we split them into common, less common, and rare types of phenomena. Right. So the less common are very, very probable events that people will report in hauntings. So things like deja vu, a sensed presence, unrecognizable sounds, cold breezes, some sort of recognizable noise like a human voice. Right. I think I heard something that's actually fairly common. It's reported in 65% of the sample. Positive sensed presences are 83% of the sample. So, one of the things you can take from the SSE is that most of the common subjective events you see reported on TV shows, and really even see in some field work a lot of times, are very, very commonly occurring phenomena. Now, where things get more interesting is in the less common category. That's where you get your psychokinesis. That's where you get your nondescript visual apparitions, your distinct apparitions, teleportation, right? And like I said, object movement, both in terms of objects moving on their own or being thrown and breaking, right? But then you get to the rare category, right? Object levitation. mythical type beings, folklore type beings, fires. And here's an odd one. People rarely report anomalous tastes,
Yeah, I
right?
thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, tastes only occur in about 25% of accounts. So, a foul taste is rare in a haunting environment. Hot areas are relatively rare, and despite what all the movies will tell you, people reporting temporary possession is only in about 30% of accounts.
Hmm.
Right. So possession is a rarity, folks. You don't need to worry necessarily about demonic possession, if you will. It doesn't happen very often. Threatening touches are in the less common category, right? So that's where we talk about the cuts and scratches we were talking about. But I don't know about you. In my experience, Cindy, I'm looking for the less common phenomena, and when I'm looking for a place that I want to investigate, I'm looking for less common phenomena or better, because usually that's where you start seeing more objective phenomena that you can kind of capture with using a hotspot method, using multiple cameras and audio recorders, et cetera, et cetera.
I completely agree with you. I tell people one of my bucket list items as a paranormal investigator is that poltergeist case. The one that is similar to the ones that you see in the movies. And I mean, there have been very rare cases that are like that have some amazing
Yeah.
objective measurable events that go on, but they're so extremely rare. Primarily when I go into a situation, there is a lot of those subjective events, the more common things. I feel a presence. That one is so very common. And your point's well taken from, when you were talking about earlier, you send in Susie,
Yeah.
the very sensitive Susie. Just about every group I investigate with and have investigated with, there are people that are very either, I don't want to discount what their experiences. So they're either very sensitive to something odd going on in the environment and have these subjective experiences, or they're really kind of almost priming themselves for it to
Yeah.
have these types of experiences. They're looking for it. And so just, and I think everybody's kind of like that to a degree. Just any kind of little thing, if you're on edge or you're expecting something weird to happen, it tends to happen.
Well, and
But
of course, the general work we've been doing suggests that higher transliminals, right, which is a fancy word for people with thinner boundaries between the internal self and the external self, right?
mhm,
That these haunting environments, these liminal spaces, right, these
mhm.
spaces where weird things happen, tend to flood them more. Right,
Yeah.
they're having more stuff coming into their system, and so it's kind of rolling over, and the system's overloading a little bit, right?
Mhm.
And thus more and more phenomena keep getting felt and reported and observed by that person. And there's also a simpler explanation, which is, I don't know about you, but when you have younger, newer people come onto the team,
Yeah.
um, through normal psychological suggestion and contagion, but really what we're dealing with here is fear, right? They're anxious.
Yeah.
And that anxiety and that fear, I think, also plays a role when people walk into those sort of environments. And I think it makes them more likely to feel like they're having a lot of phenomena occur to them.
Yeah, and that's a really great point. Aside from doing investigations, I do a lot of tours, and there are some people that come on these tours that, yeah, they're freaked out before they even walk in the door. And so, yeah, every time a light flickers or every time, somebody shuffles their foot or clears their throat or any little thing, it really sets them off, and they'll get very jumpy.
Yeah.
And so, it's kind of like, you're right, fear does play a role if people aren't used to these types of situations.
Well, and in fact, I might say, part of the job is of training people to be citizen scientists, if you're taking them into the field, is waiting for them to get their haunting sea legs. right?
Yes.
Getting
Yes.
them through enough places where they're like, well, instead of crying and flipping and screaming if they do see something, getting them, kind of dead inside like we are, where you're like, oh, well, that happened, and you're like,
That's cool. Yeah.
because I
Here
don't know
comes a
about you.
flying around. Yeah.
Oh yeah, because I've always, anytime I've talked about this in a college classroom, there's always students who are like, "Oh my God, how can you deal with this?" And you're like, "I've been
Yes.
doing it for years. I'm used to it."
Yeah.
And in fact, I've had a lot of members over the years where I'm just like, "Yep, well, you've gotten really scared. Get back in there, and after 4 or 5 more times doing this, you'll be ready to really document well because you'll be used to the weird stuff going on."
Yeah, and that's really true, and I really do my best to reassure people that are very jumpy like that and say, "I've been doing this for a very long time. I've seen some weird stuff and, but nothing that was dangerous, nothing that, is going to hurt you in any way." I mean, yes, those types of things happen, but they're like you just mentioned, they're extremely, extremely rare. So just take a deep breath. Something weird might be going on, but you know what? You're going to be okay. You're going to be all
Yeah.
right.
Well, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think an important thing to talk about, because when we really look at the core phenomena of the SSE,
Mhm.
and this is something I've been talking to people for years about, and they always look at me like I'm crazy, because when they get scared about the idea of investigations and things that ghosts can or can't do, if you want to accept the idea of a ghost, right?
Mhm.
One of the things I always ask them is, well, what can a ghost do that a cantankerous 3-year-old can't?
Yeah.
Right? But we're terrified if the ghost does it, right? If we think it's a
Mhm.
ghost doing it, but we would pretty much laugh it off or punish a kid who scratched us if they were 3, right?
Yeah.
And I think again, it's that you know culture and myth that goes around the phenomena itself, right? It's that interaction model, our belief systems interacting with the type
Mhm.
of phenomena we're trying to capture, that makes it so terrifying for people. When in fact, and this is what I've always told people for years. I'm like, this is what a 3-year-old would do.
Mhm.
If a glass gets thrown at you, well, you've maybe been in a bar fight where that's happened, and you've been okay. So
Yeah.
it's not so much, and I think part of that's the movies,
Oh, I
because
no doubt.
you know,
No
um,
doubt.
because I have seen a lot of weird stuff, but I've yet to see anybody float in midair and get choked to death or anything along
Yeah.
those lines. Um,
Yeah.
I won't
Yeah.
lie. I won't lie. I'd like to be there if that happened, but
Yeah.
generally speaking, it doesn't get that severe. It certainly gets creepy, and I'm not discounting people feeling creeped out by experiencing it. But
Mhm.
again, in real life, the severity is not that strong. And once you put together, you're like, well, okay, that happened. Okay, that
Yeah.
object moved by itself, creepy, spooky, right?
Mhm.
But not deadly and not necessarily a risk to my well-being.
No, and that's just it, and I'm glad that you went off on that tangent because for anybody that's listening that might be interested in, paranormal investigating and, give it a try because Brian's absolutely right. I mean, there's really no danger here.
Yeah.
It's just weird, you put yourself in a weird situation, weird stuff is most likely going to happen. And you
Eh,
know what? That's okay.
yeah. And I at this point, I'm almost the opposite. If something starts moving on its own, I'm like, do it again. Oh God, do it
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
Do
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. You get like us and we're like, yeah. Yeah.
Well, honestly, I might even get a little evil scientist about it, because I'm like, if someone was floating in midair by the neck, I'd be like, can you hold that for a while? Hold on, let me
Yeah.
get some,
Yeah.
let me get some
Hang on.
meters.
I
Hold
got
on,
a camera.
don't die yet. We need
Yeah.
to. There's
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I guess that's just the evil scientist in me over time. So Cindy, here's a fun question for you. What's the rarest on the SSE, right? What are some of the rarest phenomena that you've experienced in your investigations?
The rarest.
Yeah. So in other words, what's the
Hmm.
freakiest, weirdest?
I can't think of anything objectively weird. I mean, we've seen some kind of strange things on my cameras. For example, we saw what this was just recent. It was we called it cousin it, and there was somebody sitting in this room, and there was a table that my camera was sitting on, and this like what looks like an old lady's wig just materializes. And yeah, I mean, it was crazy. It was crazy. Materializes, it pops up, up right above the table, and just kind of glides in front of the table, right in front of this other investigator that's just sitting there. And we questioned him later. We're like, "Did you see that thing? What was that?" He's like, "I didn't see anything."
You know what?
So
Well, it's actually
don't
time for
know.
another commercial break, and we'll come back to the case of the demonic wig floating in just a few minutes with practical parapsychology. Stay tuned.
Okay.
Welcome back to Practical Parapsychology, everybody. I'm Brian, and this is Cindy, and we are discussing objective versus subjective haunting events using the Survey of Strange Events, the scale that my colleagues and I created back in 2019 and have been using for research studies ever since. But I'm going to backtrack. Aside from the floating demonic wig you were just talking about in our last segment. The one event that haunts me that's not super rare, it's actually less common, is that I didn't have any cameras on this, so I will never be able to prove it. It was a personal experience. But I could swear that I saw a 5-pound plastic chair teleport into a room.
Wow, that's
Like,
cool.
like like that port, like the really cheap Walmart porch chairs that you get,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Looked away from a room for about 20 seconds, looked back in. There was nobody else in this location. Looked back, there was that chair in the middle of the room.
Oh, that's wild.
Now, I mean, I can be my own skeptic and be like, did I just not detect it with my own eyes? Because that's easy. If you've ever like looked in the fridge for the ketchup and yet it was right in front of your face and it took you 5 minutes to find it. But I could swear that room was empty. And I look back over and I'm like, is there really a 5-pound chair in the middle of that room? To this day, I don't want to say it haunts me. That's cliche, but I did kind of say it. So, but yeah, that's not necessarily a lot of people have reported objects teleporting. You talked about famous cases. The Enfield poltergeist case had all sorts of teleportations day in and day out. But that's like the one time I ever experienced it. It's just I couldn't capture it in controlled environment, so I can never prove it.
Yeah, but you look at that event, and just because it wasn't recorded, does that affect whether or not it was objective or subjective?
Well, technically, as a visual anomaly, since there wasn't really the conditions, because usually object movements would be O phenomena. So I guess it would
Right.
be, on the SSE an O phenomena, but unfortunately an O phenomena with no evidence to back it up.
Right.
And that's just my old, that's my old habit of trying to document everything. Same location, by the way, actually made a. You remember those old milk crates? Those where they used to have the cardboard
Yes.
milk, right? One of those in the basement actually disappeared. We had a camera on that. It was just there and it went away. And there was only one entrance to the basement. And obviously, one of our members smuggling a 2x3 milk crate under their shirt was going to be noticeable.
Yeah,
So,
right.
we don't, we don't have an obvious explanation for that. But yeah, the phenomena gets weird. So let's turn gears. And the last thing we want to talk about today for a few minutes is that the SSE, so far we've been talking about the probabilities of what we call spontaneous accounts, right? So when we originally did the study, to put together the Survey of Strange Events, we first asked a bunch of people to report phenomena they'd experienced if they weren't expecting phenomena to occur. Right. And we called those spontaneous accounts. Right. And if you think about it logically, getting a hierarchy of events, right, and trying to get the odds on them when you're trying to get an honest hierarchy and you don't want a lot of confounds of belief or expectancy, spontaneous accounts are your best accounts. Right. Because they weren't expecting it. They weren't planning, right, for an event to occur. They weren't on a tour. They weren't a ghost hunter. They weren't, being asked to be on a TV show. So, the percentages we've been giving you guys on this show today and talking about phenomena and the way they break up, these are off of spontaneous accounts, people that had paranormal experiences happen to them that they weren't expecting, that they weren't walking into. But we do also want to note that we took samples of people for primed accounts, right? And primed accounts are where, people were on like a ghost tour. So they were having kind of like an expectancy of having phenomena occur. We also did a smaller sample of lifestyle, right? And those are probably some of the people listening to us. Those are the ghost hunters, the people that actively investigate. And that would probably be both of us as well when it came down to it. But interestingly, right, and here's where it gets a little bit more useful. We also got samples of what we called illicit Illicit accounts and fantasy accounts. So we asked some participants to purposefully lie as if they were going to be on a television show and tell people and basically fill out the SSE as, as a what do you think the producer would want you to endorse for a haunted house, right? Or the fantasy condition, which is just what do you think a haunted phenomena would look like? And it's worth noting that the layout of phenomena and how rare they occur, right? How common they are and how rare they are radically different across these conditions, right? So the difference between real life accounts, spontaneous accounts, right, where people weren't expecting it, or lifestyle accounts or primed accounts, they are certainly less common in terms of the items they endorse and the number of items they endorse compared to people that are doing make 'em up. Right. So, one thing, because obviously we can't show you the article or talk through it because we'd put you guys all to sleep. But, one kind of practical piece of information you can take from the research is that, if people say, well, have you experienced fires? Yes. Have you experienced possession? Yes. Have you experienced objects moving? Yes. There's a good chance that they're playing make 'em up. Right. People over endorsing haunting events should, have most investigators a little bit suspicious at first glance, unless they can get in there and kind of document some of that stuff. There seems to be kind of a sweet spot of phenomena that says, yeah, this is something that a lot of people have reported, and it might be genuine in the sense of they're really believing that they experienced all this type of phenomena. But as a practical tip, the more glorious and movie-like it sounds, right, the more likely it is to not at all be a legitimate case.
I completely agree with that. And in fact, one of the things that I ask uh, witnesses first off is, hey, do you do any ghost hunting yourself? Or do you like watching scary movies? Or, do you watch any of the ghost hunting shows? And I make a mental note of that because most of the time they're like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I watched the latest episode of Ghost Hunters or Ghost Adventures, or I saw the Paranormal Activity movies or whatever it is, because I think a lot of this stuff is very culturally influenced.
Yes.
And so if you are immersing yourself in the paranormal, I think in a way you're priming yourself for activity. And you get into a spooky environment, and yeah, sometimes I think they're just people that are wanting to mess with you and go, oh yeah, yeah, I saw a demon floating around and da 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 whatever. But I honestly think that there are a number of other people that kind of trick themselves into experiencing things that might be a little more ordinary or have a little more of a mundane explanation.
But I will
And
say, at the same time, from the evidence and the research that we've collected, there is the famous sheep goat effect, right?
yes.
So we know that people that are determined not to believe in paranormal phenomena, lo and behold, right,
Mhm,
tend to not experience any paranormal phenomena.
mhm.
And that's both S and O events, right? So, not
Yeah.
just necessarily an issue of the mind. And yet we know that a certain degree of belief tends to facilitate those SO events. So, I think it might be good to say, right, for
Mhm,
people listening, that it's the extremes of disbelief and belief that tends to really kind of really exacerbate phenomena or just destroy it. But a healthy amount of belief tends to get what a ghost hunter wants, which is phenomena occurring.
mhm.
Now, why that occurs is a much more complicated question we're going to save for other episodes. Um, but that having been said, because we're starting to run out of time today, I want to take a couple of minutes and talk about our first citizen science project. Cindy, is that okay with you?
Woohoo! Go for it.
Okay. All right. So we've been talking about the SSE, guys. And you're like, oh, God, I'm tired of hearing about this scale. But if you're interested in it, if you go to www.practicalparapsychology.com, we not only have a copy of the SSE scale that you can print off and use, right? Anybody can use it. But more importantly, we've put up a survey, and we're going to do our first broadcast citizen science project. So we're asking anyone who's listening that's had a paranormal experience to take 10 or 15 minutes, go to practicalparapsychology.com and take the SSE and report the phenomena they had in their most kind of spectacular paranormal event. right? And let me put some ethics in place here so everyone understands we're not collecting data with this that we're going to share with anybody. It is private. Only Cindy and I will have the data. We're not reporting anyone's individual data, right? So in other words, we're doing this just like a research study, and we're going to protect confidentiality. But the cool thing is with the scale, right? You can take it and it's going to give you a score. And if we can, over the next couple of weeks, get over 100 participants to give us their experience and fill out the SSE, we're going to share the findings on air. And you can compare your score, right, with everyone else's score that, sent in their data.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm looking forward to that. Yeah,
yeah,
that'll be cool.
So, don't make us feel bad. If you've got 5 or 10 minutes, go to the site, go to practicalparapsychology.com and, fill out the SSE. Tell us about your event. I want to emphasize, just so we're perfectly clear on this, your data is private, and we're not going to be sharing individual responses or background information. And obviously, we're not selling it to third parties because we'll get in trouble. This is on the air, right? So, so it's safe. It's safe to share. Be honest with it, and hopefully we can get a bunch of people to fill out the data, and then we can share with you guys what people's average scores are, what were common events that people reported, right? And we can see if what you guys give us is different than the research that we've collected previously.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Any closing thoughts, Cindy?
Other than if you are a paranormal investigator, or if you want to get into it, be on the lookout for those subjective versus objective events, and just document. And don't think that the subjective events are any, less valid than the objective events. You're in a strange environment and strange things are happening. Just document as much as you can about that environment, because it's going to hopefully reveal some useful information. And so, just really keep your eyes and ears open, and pay attention to those subjective things that you may be feeling or hearing or seeing or whatever it is, and don't discount those.
Yeah. And, and that's, let me hammer that in a little bit, in the sense of, even if we can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, right, that something like this is due to haunting or ghost, it is part of the experience of hauntings itself. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, from a clinical psychology perspective, it doesn't matter whether you can prove it. It's real to you, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. And I think sometimes we might try to overemphasize in science, trying to find all of these alternate explanations without, kind of just giving the cultural respect, if you will, to the fact that to that person, in the context of their belief system and their experience, this is what happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that definitely has, clinical psychology value, anthropology value, sociology value. So, I mean, there's lots of fields that would value that data in itself, whether or not you could prove it. And I certainly value it as well. It's just when it comes down to proving things, subjective events can get kind of tricky.
Well, even like we just discussed throughout the podcast, even objective events and proving anything is going to get a little bit tricky, especially when we're doing field work. I mean, you hear about scientists and how much they value the lab, doing experiments in the lab. Well, the reason for that is because a laboratory is a very controlled environment. You are able to control for a lot more variables than you are in field work. And that's what parapsychologists and not parapsychologists necessarily, but paranormal investigators do. It's all field work, but that's where the crazy stuff happens. It doesn't happen in a lab.
And I'm probably going to anger some scientists by saying this, but in some cases, the laboratory is so isolated and so different from the actual field that, if you really wanted to apply the findings you get in a lab to real life, they may not pan out, because you've removed so many other influences that are common, particularly when you're dealing with a haunted location, that you're not likely to get the same findings if you go out in the field. I think, laboratory studies aren't the panacea for all science. There are cases where it's not the best kind of research to do.
Mm-hmm. And I completely agree. I mean, we really don't know enough about these phenomenon to understand the secret sauce of what makes these things happen. And so far, what we do know is that it happens a lot more frequently in a field setting than in a lab setting. So why not stay in the field?
I think it's important to say that I'm not scared of objects moving and things like that, but I am scared of anything relating to secret sauce and the paranormal. That I don't know. Hey, I don't
It's the
know.
secret sauce.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not going to that investigation if there's secret sauce involved. I'm out.
It's the ectoplasm.
Yeah, no, thank you. But on that note, guys,
On that note.
on that note, right? Let's wrap it up for today. I want to thank everyone for listening to us. If you have any questions, please, take a look at our website, practicalparapsychology.com. Again, if you've got 10 minutes and you've got a paranormal experience, fill out the SSE for us, because we're going to try and make this a fun, interactive sort of citizen science project that's, going to go on the air. So until we see you next week, we hope you have a good day, good evening, and we'll talk to you then.
Bye.